Some stories don't begin with a kiss, or even a name. They begin with something quieter, a look, a breath, a closeness. No one else in the room notices, but you feel it anyway. Welcome to Men Being Too Intimate, an audio story series exploring what happens when two men blur the emotional lines between friendship, chance, and something harder to name. 8 episodes, 8 MBTI pairings, 8 moments when something shifts. Not because of what's said, but because of what isn't. In today's story, we meet an ENFJ, charismatic, quick to speak, always in motion, and an INFJ, quiet, watchful, drawn to stillness more than attention. They meet at a legal conference in New York. One is supposed to speak, the other just supposed to listen, but when he sat beside him when the shoulder brushed and the silence lingered, something shifted. This is episode 1. I Saw You First. New York City, Midtown. One of those sleek hotels with marble floors, long hallways, and too many elevators. Today, it's hosting the International Legal Innovations Conference, which means 100 briefcases, 24 panels, and at least 3 people pretending not to be hungover. Outside Conference Room B, the air is filled with chatter. Suits and lanyards debating policy over lukewarm coffee. Jesse is already here, early of course, not for networking. He hates that part. He's here for a specific lecture. Something about privacy law and cross-border ethics. He's checking his phone. His schedule is color-coded, clean, highlighted. His coffee is still too hot to drink. And he's already chosen his seat. Jesse's in his late 20s. Fair skin, dark brown hair parted neatly but soft at the edges. Black slacks not too fitted. White dress shirt, sleeves rolled twice at the forearm. No tie. No badge showing. He sits mid-row, left side. Not the front. Not the back. Just enough distance to see everyone without being seen himself. He clicks off his screen, takes a pen from his inner pocket, and waits. Marco enters 5 minutes late. No coffee, just a silver water bottle held loose in one hand, the other in his pocket. He moves like someone who's used to being watched. Not because he needs attention, but because he knows what to do with it. His suit is Italian cut. Pale blue, clean lines, no tie. Shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Jacket open, posture casual. The kind of fit that says this is easy for me. There's a 5 o'clock shadow on his jaw. His dark hair swept back, not styled. Just lived in. Marco scans the room, briefly, disinterested. Not looking for anyone until he sees the empty seat mid-row, next to a man with a black pen and a full cup of coffee that hasn't been touched. Marco starts down the aisle, his water bottle tapping softly against his thigh, and as he gets closer, he sees him. Jesse doesn't look up, but Marco sees enough. The hair, the rolled sleeves, the stillness. He smiles, just slightly, and sits beside him. Marco leans back into his chair, the soft creak of the cushion beneath him barely audible over the echo of the microphone up front. He scans the stage briefly. Boring. The speaker's voice is too soft, too unsure. He already knows how this panel will go. He glances sideways. The man next to him is still, focused. Pen in hand. Phone off. Eyes sharp. Not just listening, but dissecting. There's something about the way he holds his shoulders. Controlled. Guarded, like he's used to shrinking his presence in loud rooms. Marco shifts slightly, leans forward, places his water bottle gently under the seat. Jesse glances sideways, only for a second. The man next to him, light blue suit, open collar. Hair swept back, stubble along the jaw. Relaxed posture like he's never had to try too hard. European Italian, maybe? Jesse notices the cuff of his shirt, just barely brushing the edge of his wrist. The watch, sleek, silver, probably expensive, but worn in. He smells faintly like bergamot and clean linen. Jesse looks away, quickly, back to his notebook. But the moment lands and it doesn't quite leave. Neither of them speak, but the distance between them just got smaller. The room is quiet. The speaker drones on. Jesse has just looked away, but the air between them has shifted. Now Marco speaks, not to invite conversation, but to nudge the silence open. Just enough to see if it moves. Marco tilts his head just slightly toward Jesse. Not enough to invade, Just enough to reach him? His voice stays low, dry, almost conversational. Is he reading us the terms and conditions of a toaster? Jesse doesn't laugh, not exactly, but the smile comes, subtle, soft. The corner of his mouth curves like it wasn't invited. Like it surprised even him. He doesn't look up, doesn't respond. Just keeps writing. Marco doesn't press. He leans back again, water bottle untouched beneath him. Slides one hand casually into his pocket. And smiles. It's not a conversation, not yet. But in a room filled with suits and slides and sanctioned ideas, someone just broke the surface. And someone else let him. He shouldn't have smiled. Jesse knows it. It was instinct. A flicker. Like an ember stirred by air. He's not here for distractions. Not for strangers in blue suits and expensive watches. Not for water bottles under chairs or voices that lean too close and speak in metaphors. And yet, he can feel Marco beside him. Not looking at him. Not speaking. But there in the shape of his silence. In the scent of linen and bergamot. In the casual presence of someone who has always been looked at, and now is looking back. Jesse shifts in his seat. Crosses one leg over the other. Holds his pen a little tighter. A second later, Marco adjusts too, a subtle slide to the left. To let someone else into the row behind them. Their shoulders brush. Neither of them move. Not for a second. Not more than they need to. It felt too warm in here. Or maybe that's just his skin remembering something it shouldn't. He stares down at his notes. His handwriting isn't as neat anymore. Marco leaned in again and said, "Must be a really thrilling data set up there. I think someone in the back just fell asleep face first into a spreadsheet." Jesse laughs. This time he doesn't hide it. Not loud, but real. His shoulders even shake. He still doesn't look at Marco. But his voice comes. Quiet, dry, perfectly timed. "You just made me not fall asleep." And now it's a conversation, not much of one, but enough. A language made from shared boredom. Brush sleeves and a smile that came too easily. They don't say much else, not because they couldn't, but because someone 2 rows down turned, finger pressed to lips, quiet. The reminder that they weren't here for each other? Not yet. Not supposed to be. The lecture drags on, slides flip, but the space between them is louder than the words on stage. Jesse writes one more line. Not notes, just a motion to look occupied. Marco leans forward. Bends down to retrieve his water bottle from the carpet beneath the chair. And in that small motion, when his eyes tilt back up, the seat beside him is empty. Jesse's gone. Slipped out between the last slide and the first clap. No glance back, no word. Just the faint trace of coffee, and the echo of a smile he hadn't meant to give. Marco sits still, water bottle in hand, watching the door that already closed. The applause feels far away. For a moment, he doesn't hear any of it. He only sees the space beside him. The lecture ends in a flood of voices. People spill into the hallway, hungry for air, for coffee, for conversation. Jesse doesn't linger. He doesn't want to be caught in the noise. Instead, he slips into the men's room at the far end of the corridor. There are 3 urinals. The far left is occupied. Jesse takes the far right, of course, the corner, the space no one notices. Marco enters. He doesn't hesitate, doesn't scan, doesn't second guess. He takes the middle, between. The sound is quiet. Just water against porcelain, a breath, a pause. Marco looks sideways. Brief. Too brief to be an accident. Long enough to be noticed. Jesse notices. He stiffens. The pen from earlier still in his pocket. A reminder of focus, of rules. He keeps his eyes forward. But the glance is there. The weight of being seen in a place no one is supposed to look. Marco exhales through a tune. Simple, casual, like it meant nothing, like it never happened. And yet the silence after feels heavier. At the sink, they stand side by side. Neither speaks at first. Just the sound of water soap. The kind of silence that feels too deliberate. Jesse glances sideways. The man is taller up close, shoulders broad, shirt collar open, badge visible now. But Jesse doesn't read it, not yet. Marco notices. Smiles faintly into the mirror. Leans just enough to make it feel intentional. I couldn't help noticing. You were the only one who actually smiled back there. Jesse's hands still under the water. The comment lands too easily, too directly. He doesn't meet Marco's eyes. Just reaches for a paper towel, drying slow, measured. Jesse replied, "You just caught me off guard." Marco chuckles, the kind of laugh that makes it hard to tell if he's amused or satisfied. "Then I'll have to try again." Silence lingers between them, not uncomfortable, but sharp enough to notice. Jesse dries his hands, gaze fixed on the mirror. Marco leans casually against the counter, watching him from the corner of his eye. The pause stretches, until Marco breaks it. "You got lunch plans?" It's not what he expected. Too simple, too direct. The answer should be no. He should walk out. Coffee, quiet, another lecture. That was the plan. But something in Marco's tone, like he's already certain Jesse will say yes, pulls the word out of him before he can stop it. No, I don't." Marco smiles. The kind of smile that doesn't just sit on his mouth. It pulls through his shoulders, his stance, the way he reaches for the door handle. "Good. Then you're with me." It isn't a question. But Jesse follows anyway. They find a table tucked against the window. Marco doesn't bother with the menu. Jesse sets his notebook tucked into his jacket pocket. They barely have time to settle. Marco leans forward, smile easy. "I'm Marco, by the way." Jesse parts his lips, ready to answer. Then suddenly someone interrupts. "Marco Bellini. Looking forward to your lecture tomorrow." A handshake. A laugh. Marco turns, charm effortless. "Signore Bellini. Everyone's talking about your session." Again. Another pull. Another grin. And Jesse sits back watching. He slips a hand into his jacket. Flicks open his schedule. There it is, Marco Bellini. Circled days ago. Marco had been pulled away almost the moment they sat down. Jesse stayed quiet, watching, noticing. The way Marco's smile shifted slightly depending on who spoke. The easy warmth, the practiced nod. The kind of presence that filled the room without effort. He wasn't part of the conversation, he was watching it. The well-wishers drifted away. Chairs scraped back. Voices blended again into the cafe's low hum. Marco didn't return right away. He was at the counter, leaning toward a waiter. That same warmth, that same unbothered charm. Jesse caught fragments. Room 1102, tiramisu, a bottle of red. It wasn't showy, it wasn't hidden. It was just the most natural thing in the world. Marco turned back toward the table. Noticing Jesse, noticing only him, he walked over, easy, deliberate, placed a hand on Jesse's shoulder. "Come with me to my room." Not a question, but an invitation. Just a step already taken, spoken out loud. Jesse froze, caught between refusal and inevitability. Then Marco reached for his hand, pulled him up, and Jesse went. The elevator ride was silent, too silent. Jesse stood just far enough away to keep from brushing against him, but close enough to feel the heat of presence in the narrow space. Marco didn't speak, didn't need to, he just pressed the button. 11. And waited, relaxed, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Room 1102. Spacious, modern. The kind of room that swallows sound so the world outside can't intrude. Jesse stepped inside. Hands empty, nothing to anchor him. Marco tossed his jacket across the chair, loosened his collar with one hand. Crossed the room with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere. That's when Jesse saw them, on the desk near the window. A small black case, half open. Inside, a pair of silver cufflinks. Not gaudy, not forgotten. Polished. Waiting. The kind of detail you wear when the room expects your voice, and you know they'll be watching. Marco turned back, smiling faintly. Closed the space between them like it was inevitable. Make yourself at home. The food will find us here. Jesse's pulse was quicker now. The order had already been made. The number already given. He was in a room he hadn't planned to be in. Standing across from a man who moved like every decision was obvious, and Jesse still hadn't found a reason to leave. Marco moved easily through the room, as if it were an extension of himself. Jesse lingered just inside the door. Shoulders tight, hands loose at his sides, a man who knew how to stand still. But not how to stay untouched. Marco turned, leaning against the desk, fingers brushing the silver cufflinks in their case. He didn't fasten them. Just toyed with the edges, eyes still on Jesse. "You're quieter than I expected." Jesse's throat tightened. He could have said nothing. Should have. But the words slipped out anyway. "Maybe you expected too much." Marco laughed. Not loud. Soft, under his breath. As though he'd been waiting for exactly that answer. He pushed away from the desk, closed the space between them in 3 steps. Close enough that Jesse could feel the warmth in the air, the faint trace of bergamot and linen. Jesse didn't move, didn't back away, but his chest rose quicker, sharper. Marco's hand lifted. Not to grab, not to pull. Just to brush lightly against his sleeve. Testing. Asking without asking. "See? Not so serious." The sound cut through the silence. Just a moment. Room service rolled in. Pasta, sandwich neatly halved. Steam curling from the plates, and a bottle of red in a silver stand. 2 glasses waiting. Marco signed, tipped, closed the door. And just like that, the room was theirs again. Marco poured without pause. The wine was deep, dark, catching the low light of the room. He set the first glass in front of Jesse, his hand steady, certain. Jesse opened his mouth. "Oh, I don't think I should. I still have—" Marco's eyes flashed, his smile curling sharp and warm at once. "No wine, my God. You must. I chose this for us." The word lingered, not just in the glass, but in the air between them, as though this wasn't lunch at all, as though it was already a story they'd both remember. Jesse lifted his glass, not because he meant to, but because he couldn't not, and the wine touched his lips. Warm, heavy. The first taste of something that felt like it had already begun. The pasta steamed, the sandwich set cleanly halved. But it was the wine Marco kept circling back to. Pouring, swirling, lifting in easy arcs, Jesse took small sips, measured, trying not to let the warmth rush too quickly through him. "You're sipping like it's medicine. Relax, it's wine." Marco laughed, a full, low sound that filled the room like a chord. He leaned closer across the small table, elbow propped, glass hanging loose in his hand. The food barely mattered now, a few bites here and there, enough to pass as lunch, but the real meal was this. The leaning in, the way his eyes caught Jesse's and didn't let go. The kind of attention Jesse wasn't used to. The kind that made him forget the outline of his own rules. Marco set his glass down. Not loud. Soft, deliberate. And his hand brushed Jesse's wrist on the table. Light, like testing a wire before touching it again. Jesse didn't pull away either. The air had already shifted. The wine just made it easier to notice. And as the plates cooled between them, words began to feel unnecessary. Jesse should have pulled away. Should have stepped back into the safety of structure, into the neatness of his schedule. But the pull was stronger. The inevitability louder than reason. They moved without needing to say it, hands brushing shoulders, the quiet rhythm of breath filling the silence the lecture had left behind. It wasn't hurried. Not clumsy, not the kind of thing that disappears by morning. It was slower, exploratory, as though each movement was a way of seeing the other more clearly. Jesse's hand against Marco's jaw. Marco's fingers steady at the curve of Jesse's back. 2 men who should have stayed strangers, finding that silence had already told them too much. By the time the city turned gold outside the window, they were already in the dark together. The distance was gone now. The world narrowed to the brush of skin, the weight of silence filled by breath, the warmth of a body that wasn't supposed to be here. "You still don't know my name." Marco's mouth curved into a laugh, low, genuine, close enough to feel. "Then tell me, and I'll remember it." And in that moment, it no longer mattered who had found who first. It was quieter now. The kind of quiet that comes when breath slows, when the room remembers itself after the storm. Jesse lay on his side, shirt half-buttoned again, watching the faint glow across Marco's jaw. "I knew who you were. I circled your name in the program. I'll be at your lecture tomorrow." "So you knew, and still you came here with me." "Even better." He leaned in, pressed the lightest kiss to Jesse's temple. Soft, unhurried, as though it was nothing at all. But when Jesse turned, half expecting words to follow, a promise, a thread, something about tomorrow, Marco said nothing. Just lay back, eyes closing, as if silence was enough. Jesse sat up slowly, pulling his jacket over his shoulders. On the desk, near the window, the black case still sat open. Silver cufflinks glinted faintly in the low light, untouched, waiting. The man for tomorrow. The man he hadn't really met yet. He left without pushing for more, but carried the silence and the glint of silver out with him into the hall. The morning came fast. Too fast. Jesse had dressed deliberately. Shirt pressed, tie straight, notes tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. Everything back in order. Everything as it should be, but order didn't steady him. Not after last night. He took his seat near the middle again. Not front row, not hidden, a place where he could see everything. A place where maybe he could be seen, the stage was set. Name projected across the screen, Marco Bellini. Exactly as circled in his schedule. Marco moved through the room like he'd rehearsed it. Not for this day, but for every day like it. The jacket pulled from the hanger. The pale blue one from yesterday was folded aside. Today called for something sharper. He set the cufflink case on the desk. Silver, polished, catching the morning light. One at a time. Slid through the cuff, twisted firm. Perfect. The tie followed. Black. Clean. The knot pulled smooth against his collar. He stood in front of the mirror, tilted his head, ran a hand once through his hair, swept back, just enough. The man in the glass looked ready. The man who filled stages, who drew crowds, who carried charm like second nature. Whatever last night had been, it wasn't for this room. This room belonged to the speaker. To Marco Bellini, the name on the program. He straightened his shoulders and left for the hall. The crowd had thickened. Suits lined every aisle. Programs folded under arms, coffee cups drained to their last drops. Jesse kept his seat, middle row. Notebook out, pen balanced across the page. But his eyes weren't on the stage. He was waiting. And then he appeared. Marco. Not the man from last night. Jacket fitted, tie knotted, silver at his cuffs catching the light. His stride was smooth, confident. Each step pulled forward by the staff member walking ahead, guiding him, directing him. Jesse stood not all the way, just half as if to catch his eye, as if to speak, but Marco didn't stop. Didn't look, just walked past. Close enough that Jesse could smell the faint trace of cologne again, but far enough to feel like the night had been imagined. The staff led him down the aisle, straight to the reserved seat at the front. He smiled at someone else, shook another hand, and Jesse remained standing in the middle of the crowd, a line of silence pressing into his chest. Marco saw him. For a beat, his step faltered. The memory of last night tugged at him. Wine, laughter, the softness of a name unspoken in the dark. He wanted to stop, but the aisle was narrow. The staffer at his side, the applause heavy. Too many eyes, so he walked past. It was easier this way, to let the room swallow him. To let Jesse think it had been only a night, easier, but not truer. The lecture was good, sharp, confident. Exactly the man they all came to see. But Jesse wasn't listening to the words. Not really. He was waiting for something in Marco's voice. That sounded like last night. It never came. And before the room stood, before the crowd pressed in, Jesse slipped his notebook shut. One smooth motion. One careful step down the aisle. Gone before the clapping swallowed him. Marco smiled as the applause rose. Nodded, shook hands on the stage, but his eyes were already scanning. The middle rows. The notebook, the quiet man with sharp eyes, Jesse. But he was gone. Marco tried to push through, a step forward. A glance to the doors, and then another hand caught his arm. Another voice, another question, pulled back, pulled in. He thought about the room, about last night, about the way Jesse's name had sounded when he finally spoke it aloud. He wanted one more chance, one more word, one more hour before the flight home. But he didn't get it. By the time the plane left for Rome, New York was already behind him, and Jesse was just another name. He should have been brave enough to keep ENFJ and INFJ, the mirror and the shadow. One bold enough to move the moment, the other quiet enough to feel its weight. Together, they are drawn to each other instantly. The warmth of charisma pulling at the gravity of depth. The spark of a smile answered by the silence of a glance. But sometimes that same pairing slips. The ENFJ, afraid to be vulnerable once the stage lights rise. The INFJ, afraid to reach for what feels too close, too soon. Both waiting, both wanting. Neither brave enough to close the distance. That's what happens when men are too intimate. When a night feels like forever, but a morning turns into silence. This was Marco and Jesse, a story of a glance that could have lasted longer, and of what it means when you let it go.
Men being too intimate.